Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of 2 nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just 2 words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. No question. It's a classic case, goes back to the early 1950s. If you grew up in Cleveland, that's the case you remember more than any other, Sam Shepard. But for those people who don't know about Sam Shepard, tell us the facts of the case and then tell us how you got involved.
Okay, so it's 1954, Bay Village, up and coming, hip middle class, upper middle class community on the lake. Young doctor and his wife have a house on Lake Road in Bay Village, and they have a 7-year-old son. Marilyn was pregnant with their second child. One night, July 4th, the night of July 3rd into July 4th, they had friends over earlier in the evening for a dinner party, including the mayor of Bay Village and some other friends. And everything was going fine. Dr. Shepard had done a surgery that day involving a young boy. He was tired. He eventually fell asleep on the day bed downstairs, and he woke up to the cries of his wife upstairs in the bedroom. And he collected his mind and he went up there, and as soon as he walked into the room, he was struck behind in the neck and passed out for some time. He remembered seeing a figure of a man with bushy hair. He eventually woke up, went to look on as to what was going on with Marilyn, and looked like she was gone and beaten very badly. He then heard some noise downstairs, somebody ruffling through items and drawers, went down, saw this figure, chased that person outside in the back, down the steps, the wooden steps to the beach, and they had a scuffle. He again lost consciousness and woke up half in the water and half on the sand. So that's the basic facts of the case.
Okay.
But what was key to this whole case was that back then it became a big media story, to the point where there were tons of journalists traipsing through the crime scene. There was a hysteria to get somebody arrested for this, and who's the most likable suspect? It's the husband, right?
Always the husband. That's right.
And but then once things got going, the attacks against Dr. Shepard as being arrogant. He had an affair at one point with a nurse from the clinic that they had, the Shepard family. They were a family of doctors. The tables turned against him, and really he had no choice. The judge even told Dorothy Kilgallen, who was one of the premier gossip columnists in the country, that don't worry about this case. He's guilty as hell. This is what the judge said. The jurors' names and pictures were in the 3 papers at the time: Cleveland Plain Dealer, Cleveland Press, Cleveland News. The lawyer didn't get much discovery like we have now. And the lawyer really wasn't a very accomplished criminal defense lawyer. But the case went to trial within 3 months
Hmm.
after the murder, and he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life. And then it wasn't until later on that F. Lee Bailey got involved to do post-conviction appeals. They brought in a forensic professor from Berkeley, who was the father of modern forensic science, who came up with a report that showed that Sam couldn't have done it because of the blood and other things in the crime scene. And eventually the case went to the US Supreme Court, which is the case of Shepard versus Maxwell, which defined the balance between press coverage and the right of the accused to get a fair trial. Where is that balance? And laid out the rules for media attention that we still live with today. That case is still good law. I got involved 40 years later.
Amazing.
After Shepard was acquitted the second trial, he won a new trial. He was acquitted in 1966. But he died like 4 years later, a broken man. He was doing a lot of drugs, he was drinking, he was wrestling. He kind of created a comical character himself based on popular culture reference to him. And so he died at age 46 in 1970. His son lived with the trauma of that, losing his mother and his father to a certain extent. And in 1989, 1990, the young Sam Reese found out about a guy named Richard Everling who had murdered a woman in Lakewood, that he was manipulated into her signing over her estate to him. And looking at Richard Everling, looking at all the other aspects of the case, working with the journalist and Sam Reese, we came up with this idea of trying to reopen the case. And that began the process of doing public records requests, forcing the coroner's office to release its evidence, getting DNA experts to examine that evidence. And that led to the civil case that ultimately we tried in 2000. And so I spent a lot of time talking about that case in the book because it was important to try to set the historical record straight on that. But also,
can I interrupt you for 1 second? What was, since he had already been acquitted, why reopen the case to begin with if he had already been acquitted?
Well, because there's a difference between being acquitted and being innocent.
Okay.
And, a lot of people are acquitted by a jury or the case is dismissed. And a lot of people who are not familiar with the law said, well, he beat the case. He was lucky, but he did it. He just beat the case.
Right.
So our job was to use a civil statute enacted in 86 called the Wrongful Imprisonment Act to seek a declaration that he did not commit the crime and was wrongfully convicted. That was the remedy that we used. Had never been used for somebody who was deceased. And ultimately the courts, even after we appealed it, determined that we shouldn't even have been allowed to have a trial. But that trial is now an historic record, and a lot of good stuff came out of it. We lost because much of it was based on science and other reasons about biases in the community. But we gave it our best shot. It was an important case to bring up. It educated a lot of people. It was the first court TV gavel to gavel webcast.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Huh.
And there were commentators every night talking about the case. So it was an important case, and I think it changed the views of many people.
As you know, there also was a popular television show called The Fugitive based upon that case. There was a well-known movie based on it. And the files of that case were donated to our law school. And so if somebody wants to learn more about that case, they can come to our law school because we have all the files of one of the most famous and most controversial cases in American criminal law history. Now, I'm going to show our viewers the cover of your book because it has a picture that provokes a little controversy right to begin with. It's a burning American flag. And that has to do with another case you took on. Tell us about that case.
Well, yeah, that was the Cheryl Lesson case, who was charged with inciting violence on public square during the Gulf War, where she burned an American flag. And there was a lot of controversy about whether burning the flag should be protected. But it went to the U.S. Supreme Court before our trial. And the U.S. Supreme Court, actually, Kunstler argued the case.
Another case with Bill Kunstler.
In the U.S. Supreme Court,
okay,
which held that burning the flag for political reasons, for protest and dissent, is protected under the First Amendment. As much as it might be, creating a lot of opposition. Because it's to many people, the flag is a symbol of the greatness of our country. But the First Amendment is more of a symbol to the greatness of our country. And as long as there was no other violence, but the actual burning of the flag for political purposes is protected. Cheryl Lesson was not charged with with flag desecration. She was charged with inciting the violence. And that trial, we lost, but we won on appeal.
Okay.
But there were many cases that I was involved in with flag burnings. A couple of them are in the book. And also effigy burnings, like American Indian activists would protest at opening day at Progressive Field every year. And one year, there were some protesters who burned effigies of the Wahoo and effigies of the Little Black Sambo. And they were arrested for arson. And that we had a trial as well and went up to the higher courts and were able to get those reversed, those convictions. So the symbol of the flag is more than just that we're burning America. It symbolizes that you cannot, look at the flag as like an idol. It represents the Constitution. It represents the Bill of Rights. And in my 50 years of thinking and working and doing legal cases involving the First Amendment, I've seen a lot of problems with the government clamping down on it. And we've seen it in the 60s, and we've seen it this year. And we thought, and the publisher thought, and Ron Hill from Act 3 actually drew that design, captures a side of America that many of us don't want to acknowledge, but is reality.
Terry, as we wind up this podcast, I want to ask you, what are some of the lessons that you want people to take away from this book? In other words, leadership lessons, whether it be a law student, whether it be a lawyer, whether it be an activist. Give me some of those lessons that you'd like people to take away.
So, listen, there are many kinds of lawyers. And our school trains all the various options for lawyers to develop a career. For me, being a lawyer requires a passion for justice. And my hope is that lawyers see the passion in themselves to make a difference in society. And that it's not just technical legal arguments, it's allowing yourself to engage in the process with your clients, with the courts, and stand up for what you believe in. And that's what I try to do. And I'm hoping that young lawyers and law students will take up that torch of lawyers. Historically, there are lawyers who are, radical lawyers, people's lawyers, progressive lawyers, whatever you want to talk about it, who put themselves on the line for their clients. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't always about you, it was about the people you represented and their causes. And then if it means rubbing up against authority, then so be it. I know that's hard to understand for many people because you have families, you have obligations financially. You don't want to get disbarred, but there's a way of pushing the envelope in an ethical and honest and careful way, because you look at cases, you look at the progress we've made. It's because people took a chance of coming up with an idea that no one thought about before, and that's one of the things that I'm hoping I pass to the legal profession. The second thing is the idea of using law as an instrument for social change. Okay, and that's what I've tried to do, even in the cases which were not high profile, to try to push the envelope a little bit, trying to educate people, try to get attitudes changed. Like the Wahoo and the Cleveland Indians baseball team. I started doing that work in the late 70s. And look, it took all those years for the ownership of the team to come to grips with the fact that we got to do something to take away that image. It's not right. Okay, in the face of a lot of people who love that mascot, and even went to the extent of wanting to change the name. And so this is an example of working on cases, losing cases, but creating the narrative and the ideas that eventually come to fruition, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so I've learned how to lose for the right reason. Right. But I've won some cases too, so it kind of balances out.
As we wind up, I do want to reflect a little bit on this past year. In fact, you could argue that one of the reasons that the Cleveland Indians are no longer going to be the Cleveland Indians, they'll be something, but it won't be the Indians, is because of what happened back on May 25th of last year, the killing of George Floyd. And then another equally disturbing incident occurred not long ago on January 6th with the insurrection. And in fact, I believe you actually talk a little bit about that before your book was published. You added some words about that. What are your thoughts of what's happened in the last year in the terms of racial justice, in terms of extremism and hate, and your thoughts about whether or not we have an optimistic future? Because I think a lot of people are pessimists, and I want to know whether you're an optimist or a pessimist in light of what's happened.
Well, it's no secret that there is a problem with policing. And I'm not saying that all police are bad, but there's a systemic problem where the encounters with citizens sometimes lead to ugly situations, including deaths that could have been avoided. And part of that has to do with racism, either subtle or blatant. The George Floyd murder, and I call it a murder because everything I could see about that, I know the guy's going on trial this week as we are taping this. But it was such a horrific visual that had just ignited millions of people to take to the streets around the country and speak out against this and call for major reforms. But this is something that's been going on. It happened in 2014 in Ferguson. It's happened in Cleveland with the Tamir Rice case and the 137 shot case, which I talk about in my book, because a major aspect of my practice was police misconduct litigation. I was doing it before it was even in vogue, and got my ass kicked many times before I started winning those cases. But it was a long haul because I started doing those cases back in the 80s, where one federal judge, and I mentioned this in the book, Judge Manos, told me privately in his office, "You got a lot of nerve bringing a case like this. Who do you think you are?" But, from his perspective, you couldn't win against the police. No jury would find the police to have engaged in criminal conduct or misconduct of any kind.
Right.
But then you had Rodney King, you had other cases and videos, which brought to reality for many people what happened. So this is a struggle that's ongoing. We have made some strides this year with the bill that was recently passed, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which I encourage people to look at and support. So racism in America is still alive. We've seen it with what happened at the Capitol. And we see it in many, many communities across the country. And it needs to be addressed because we will never realize the American dream until everybody is treated equally and fairly in every walk of life. And policing is a critical issue right now. And if it's not addressed, we're in big trouble.
I want to read to our readers a summary of this book that's on the back jacket of the book. It says, America finds itself facing a pandemic, unrest over police violence, divided over the most contentious election in the past century. This book is a story of roads traveled and lessons learned by a radical lawyer who came of age in similarly trying times, an imperialist war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the struggle for academic freedom, women's liberation. Terry Gilbert continues to fight for all people who are basically feel that they're shut out of the American dream. Now, Terry, after an illustrious career, you have every right to retire, but you still are fighting. You're still practicing. Why is that?
Partly because I don't know what else to do. I mean, especially during a pandemic. I mean, all I do is sit in front of a computer and work. But I'm passing the torch, okay? And this is important because in one of the final chapters, I talk about the younger lawyers that work with me. And I let them join my firm as partners. When Gordon Friedman, he retired, he's a little older than me, and I think I have a few more years left. But I enjoy what I do. I think it's important work. It's tough to keep up with the technology, but, I have help and I get to pick and choose the cases I want to be involved in. So right now I'm fine with staying active.
I want your next book, and I want you to write a second one, and I have the title of the second book for you already, Passing the Torch. because that's exactly what you are doing right now. It's why retirement, at least right now, is not in your vocabulary. It's also why I hope everyone reads this book, Trying Times by Terry Gilbert, a lawyer's 50-year struggle fighting for rights in a world of wrongs. I was honored to write the foreword of that book, but more importantly, I was honored to read it and to learn lessons myself. So Terry, I want to thank you again for joining us on Living Justice, Living Leadership, and thanks for a year of standing up for what's right, and certainly a life of living justice.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Lee. And your forward was terrific, by the way.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you added that at the end of the podcast. I'll make sure that gets into the podcast and we don't edit that out.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks again, Terry. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah.